Alrighty, here we go. Today is June 17th, 2018, and this is episode 219 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me tonight, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Good evening, Jerry. I'm glad to see the volcano did not get you in your Joe versus the volcano imitation.
They were. I think they were going to try to sacrifice me to get it to calm down, but I managed to escape.
But I hope you had a good trip to Hawaii, which is in part why we haven't recorded lately.
It was phenomenal. Probably the best vacation I've ever had. So.
Wow, and then you got to come back to me. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it was good. And you just had your own vacation too.
I did 10 days in Colorado with the wife, and it was great. Love me some Colorado.
Yeah, it's beautiful country out there.
Yeah, we wandered all over and all over the mountains and the parks and cities and all sorts of fun stuff. And now we're back to reality.
Yep, that's the way it works. So just a reminder that before we get into the show, the thoughts and opinions we express on the show are ours and do not represent those of our employers. And also a thank you, a heartfelt thank you to our Patreon donors. Thank you
Absolutely.
very much.
Thank you, guys.
And so also, by the way, this is our Father's Day episode. So happy Father's Day. And also we were unable to have a GDPR Day spectacular, which I was actually hoping to do, but I was on a beach instead. So hopefully everybody still has all their arms and legs post May 25th. I've not heard a ton of horror stories, but I think the damage toll is still out. So.
Do we need to do a GDPR focused episode one of these days?
I think we absolutely do. Yeah. Part of the reason it hasn't really made a lot of sense is that there's so much that's kind of misunderstood and not fully settled yet with respect to the GDPR. So, but I think that's really rapidly coming to a close. So. Anyway, moving into our stories. The first one we have tonight comes from CSO Online, and the title here is, "What Does a Ransomware Attack Cost? Beware the Hidden Expenses." And, hopefully this is relatively self-explanatory or unsurprising, but they go through a couple of examples about some of the hidden costs of dealing with a ransomware attack if you're an organization. So the first example they bring up is the Erie County Medical Center, who had I think it was last July, they had a couple thousand workstations locked up and being held for a $30,000 ransom. They actually ended up spending $10 million in response to that attack, which included things like overtime from their employees and services and software and whatnot. So, relatively small. I think the whole point of this article is, while the ransom itself is often somewhat meager, the kind of the totality of the costs that you rack up is significantly higher. And by the way, that's almost without regard to whether or not you pay the ransom. You're going to incur these costs.
That's some of the psychology behind the ransomware cost, right? The bad guys know if they keep it within a relatively palatable range, most victims, or some proportion of victims at least, will do the math and say, I don't want to spend $4 million on cleanup. I'll spend the $50,000 on the ransom and hope they give me the key and I can move on with my life. So if it were a stupid amount of money, they probably would not get many takers.
True. But I think in the end analysis, a lot of organizations who even do pay the ransom end up spending tons of money.
Well, yeah, absolutely, because it usually causes a knee-jerk reaction. Well, maybe not knee-jerk, but at least a reaction of why did we fall into this trap and how can we avoid it again, which causes a cycle of spend and consultants and hiring and beefing up the InfoSec department typically.
Yep. And the next example they had was the city of Atlanta, which we covered a couple of weeks or months back, I guess now. It was back in March. At the time, they had spent $5 million in response. And it's not referenced in this article, but there was some news while I was out on the beach that Atlanta was actually requesting another $9.5 million, I think, related to this, which is, will take the total up to about $14 million. That's some serious money. And I get the feeling, though, that some organizations are, it kind of reminds me of the old Kevin Mitnick AT&T story, where AT&T tried to, throw the cost of a building into the damages, right? And so I think to some extent there, we do see that. Like I believe, I don't know this to be fact, but I believe that the city of Atlanta at least is tying the cost of some pretty significant upgrades and migrations of their IT from traditional systems to cloud. At least that's kind of the implied stuff in some of the stories I've read.
Well, one quick aside on Atlanta too. Another story that we're not covering in depth, but came out was that they lost years of police dash cam footage.
Right.
As part of the attack, which now you're looking at potentially throwing off prosecutions and various legal issues. So in that case, it gets even uglier when you look at what could be the potential cost involved, and how do you potentially even quantify the cost of, hey, we had a deads to right case against this bad guy, and now we can't even prosecute him because we lost this dash cam footage.
Yeah, or defend your officers against wrongful accusations or
sure.
Contra, right? So yeah, I mean that's bad. It's bad news. I mean it's high stakes right there, and
yep.
I suspect we're only on the upswing here. And then next they talk about in Colorado, the Department of Transportation. They had to set aside. There's no clear indication of how much they spent, but they set aside $2 million to recover from an infection on 2,000 systems. So there's clearly a wide disparity in the amount of money different, especially government entities, seem to be spending in response. But there's a quote from a company called Cybersecurity Ventures who said that they're predicting the damages in 2019 from ransomware will exceed $11.5 billion. And that's not just the ransomware, people paying ransom. It's, all the associated costs, which is a pretty significant amount of money. And, again, the whole point of this article is when you're thinking about how significant a threat ransomware is and trying to figure out, what is the potential downside, the extent of the costs go far beyond the ransom, and there's lots of other categories of costs, like engaging an incident response company, and if you have to make any, like the city of Atlanta did. By the way, I'm not accusing them of doing anything improper, but there may be a situation like this may make you realize that the current way you have your IT structured is unsustainable going forward if you're going to avoid a similar thing in the future. So you may have some really significant cash outlays to recover from these things, and all those costs may not be well easy to account for beforehand.
And there's a bit of a political and game aspect here too, where you have this event, it's a terrible event, but you've had all these ideas pending for many years, or things you want to do, or things you need to do. And some ways, psychologically, it makes sense for executives to lump all that into one big hit and move on. And then they can say, hey, this was all because of this breach. And, kind of like a write down of goodwill or of assets in a bad acquisition.
Sure.
Sometimes it's easier to just take the lumps and move on. So yeah, if you've got that, you're already in a bad situation, make the best of the bad situation by lumping in as many other costs as you can that are even ancillary related to your breach recovery.
Yeah, the bad news is already out there. You may as well stuff as much loss as you can into that, because
Right.
it's typically viewed as a one-time thing, right? So it's not
Hopefully.
well, I mean, I think from the perspective of investors, an incident like this is viewed as a
Right.
one-time thing. It's not, your ongoing costs didn't increase as a result of your, or significantly increase as a result of the incident. So anyway, moving on to yet another ransomware-related story. This one comes from Bank Info Security, and the title is "Mental Health Provider Pays Ransom to Recover Data." And so the story here is a Minnesota-based organization called the Associates in Psychiatry and Psychology paid, I think it was if I'm not mistaken, about $44,000 to recover the data of about I'm trying to find the exact number, but about 6,500 people. And they ended up reporting this to the Department of Health and Human Services because it was a HIPAA related breach. But one thing that, by the way, when I read this article, I don't know if it was just the author of this article, but it seemed like this company, at least in the article again, came off as being like really cavalier. I don't know if you picked up on that too.
Yeah, a little bit. Go on. But yes, there was some weird vibe there. But my thought was, who knows how much legal representation is in between them and whoever's reporting on this. And
yeah. So anyway, the organization here made the decision that it would be more economical for them to pay the ransom than it would be to try to recover the data.
The ransom was $55,000.
$55,000. Thank you.
Yep, 4 Bitcoin at the time was valued at $55,000.
I knew 4 was in there somewhere.
Yep, no, it's all good. Well, what's interesting too, and I think health providers have an extra special difficulty here because they're there to provide critical services to their patients. And if something gets in the way of providing critical care to their patients, their onus is on getting that care back as quickly as possible. So, you can almost see that the logic making a little more sense in a healthcare situation of saying, just pay the ransom, get our systems back, and we'll deal with the rest later.
Yeah. So, in this particular case, they were some of the cavalierness, I guess, was, they were basically saying that, hey, we an attacker really couldn't use the data very, without our software. While it's not encrypted, they wouldn't have had access to the software needed to access the data. And I've seen that attitude quite a lot, and I'm not sure that's a good attitude to take.
Yeah, that's a dangerous assumption.
Very, very dangerous assumption. But you mentioned a good point, and this kind of goes back to the previous story and why I really wanted to talk about these together. In this particular case, they found it. I believe they actually had the ability to recover the data from backups, but they chose to pay the ransom because it was a more expedient way to get back up and running. And that's really odd and kind of frustrating, at least for me as a security practitioner. It's kind of a frustrating position to be in because you have the ability, you have the capability to restore, yet it's a more economically viable or an attractive pursuit to pay the ransom. And so that kind of says to me, going forward, not only do we have to make sure that we actually have the data backed up, but it needs to be, the totality of the IT environment needs to be such that you can actually recover in something of a reasonable time frame. And so I guess point is, this is a long way to say that it seemed like their recovery time objective was not very good, or was not in line with what their business needed. How about that?
Could be, yeah, that's fair. But I would say that in general, assuming that the bad guys are on the up and up and they give you the key in a timely manner, and the key works, I think that's always going to be faster than trying to rebuild from backups.
Well, okay, I will go with that. I agree.
Unless you have like VMware snapshots that you could just drop back into place and spin back up immediately. But
I agree with that. But here's we didn't talk about this on the previous story, but it is material to the discussion, and that is, I guess if you're willing, I'm having a real hard time coming to terms with this, but if you're willing to just decrypt things and then move on, I guess that does make sense. But we
don't know what their follow-up response was.
Well,
right? We don't know if they did a root cause analysis and said, okay, we got this ransomware because we're using, or we haven't patched this particular vulnerability. Okay, let's get those patched. Okay, let's do this. And again, as a healthcare provider, their main concern may be, let's make sure that we can provide a standard of care to our patients in the short term. Now, am I saying they're making the best possible decisions, or that we would make those decisions? I don't know. I mean, we weren't in that situation, but I would say that I think a lot of large organizations that have a backup and recovery strategy have a really good strategy on paper that really sucks in the real world, and they don't know it until they really do it, and then they find out how weak it is, and it's not nearly as simple as all the backup and recovery documentation says it's going to be.
Yeah, I guess that, I think all of what you just said makes good sense, and you're absolutely right. Everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face.
Right?
Was it George Foreman that said that? I think, right? I guess the specific thing that concerns me is that you're returning to service something that was previously infected. And,
Yeah, you still have to understand the root cause analysis. Like what caused the initial compromise? What caused the initial ransomware infection, if you will? And hopefully address that.
Yeah, but, so I guess, again, it's a difficult thing to talk about in the abstract, but the concern I have is what else was there, right? I mean, okay, so yes, you've nailed the root cause. You can say that's how it propagated, but was there anything else there that happened? And how did you get comfortable that you don't need to rebuild your environment from the ground up anyway? That's an interesting question, and yeah, we don't have a lot of data on that, but right. That's by the way, that's the one thing that when I hear companies that pay the ransom, I intuitively it makes sense that it's often easier and faster to return the service, assuming everything works out the way they hope. They get the key and the key works and blah blah blah, right? But I've seen so many times where where there's smoke there's fire. The ransomware was one of an unknown number of attacks.
Right.
And so anyway,
I get it. I guess what I'm struggling with is that I think most organizations don't have folks, or aren't empowering folks to go to the level that you want to go to on this one.
Well, that's true, but I guess from a risk perspective, the concern I would have if I were this company, the concern I would have is how am I going to make sure that in another month I don't have to report another breach because
right.
I didn't completely evict all of the actors that were and at that point, now you got people throwing rocks at you saying, well, that was a really dumb thing you did. So anyway, I just think it's a really risky, for a bunch of different reasons. I think it's a risky play to take, but I get it. I do. All right, so moving on to our next story. This one comes from IT Business Edge, fairly unconventional source for our story here, or for our show here. The title is, "Did we see our first data breach of the GDPR era?"
Dun dun dun.
Dun, dun, dun. That's right. So there's an organization called Ticketfly, and apparently Ticketfly is, as far, I didn't do a ton of research on them, but they appear to be a
just phoning it in on this show, aren't you? Just phoning it in.
Phoning it in. That's right.
Still in vacation mode.
It is a service where different musical artists and things, groups like that can sign up and sell tickets to their concerts and whatnot. And so anyway, this Ticketfly was breached. They, but the kind of the twist on this is the way that Ticketfly has characterized the event. They didn't call it a data breach. They called it a cyber incident. And so the point of this particular article is this, is this kind of some unique and interesting things that we'll see going forward, where organizations are intentionally trying to avoid the phrase data breach. And in this particular case, it's almost impossible to consider it not a data breach, because 26 million email addresses, names, physical addresses, and I think a few other pieces of phone numbers, I think, showed up. I think some of the data was even provided to motherboard, device.com. and some of it showed up in the haveibeenpwned.com list. And so it's, it's very clearly a data breach. What's less clear to me, and this was actually the research I was trying to do, was figure out, where are they located? Do they have any particular ties to the EU? And I've not been able to confirm or deny that, but it'd be interesting to see. By the way, there's a whole lot of people who have a very confused view of who the GDPR does and does not apply to. And by the way, it's taken me a long time and lots of discussions with different lawyers to really get my head around it. And for instance, if this Ticketfly was a US based company and they kind of coincidentally had European citizens purchasing tickets, and those tickets were not for concerts that were in the EU, it's very unlikely that they would fall into the scope of the GDPR. And I know that I'll get lots and lots of people telling me that I'm wrong, but I will tell you, go read Spain versus Google and then come back and we'll talk.
Man, you're just being all lawyery.
Yeah. So anyway.
So speaking of lawyers, the way I read this is we're not going to call it a data breach until a court of law orders us to call it a data breach.
Yes. Correct. Correct. But I think that was the point, is like, under the auspices or in the age of the GDPR, it seems likely that, we're going to see companies not wanting to use the words data breach, that trying to find very creative ways to call it other things. And, and by the way, I wonder about things like ransomware, because, historically, a lot of the data breach reporting regimes have taken a pretty skeptical view that, you kind of have to prove that a ransomware attack didn't involve, disclosure of the data. And often that's not possible to do. But I'm wondering if we're going to see some innovation in incident reporting.
No, Your Honor, this was not a data breach. This was an unplanned and unauthorized data backup.
A rogue administrator, an undocumented administrator. That's right.
This was an unplanned cloud integration.
Oh my!
We feel this strengthens our company because it shows resilience in our data feeds.
That's right. That's right. We are all about availability.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Can't steal it if it's freely available, right?
I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah. That's
but
right.
very long story short, I think you're right that we're going to get a lot of creative wordplay over the next year or two as this all gets worked out. Because, as much as we think we know about GDPR, I think everybody who is deeply involved is waiting for case law to see what happens when things are actually, fines are levied, and then the companies fight those fines in court and see what actually survives the judiciary in the EU or perhaps other venues as this is tested in court. And I know the EU authorities have been saying from the beginning they're looking for examples. They want to make examples of big companies. So I don't think it'll take long.
No, and I would say it's also, from what I understand, I would think that organizations who are kind of flouting the law or intentionally trying to be cute are the ones that are probably going to feel the most significant wrath. So it seems like now I don't know specifically about this case. I don't know enough about this case, but it seems like if you were to try to get out of your reporting responsibilities because you were calling it a cybersecurity incident rather than a data breach, when in fact some data was leaked, I think they're going to look upon that really unfavorably, and that's probably going to get you the biggest fine. So, but we'll see. We don't really know. We know that that the data protection authorities in Europe have told people very publicly that they are staffing up aggressively with with enforcement people, and so we know that they're out there. And by the way, this is this episode's coming out about 2 weeks after the GDPR went into effect, but the first lawsuits were actually filed on May 25th, and there was a guy named Max Schrems in Austria, who was the person who, I believe, if memory serves, he was the person who got the EU Court of Justice to invalidate the old safe harbor data transfer rule.
What is his lawsuit regarding?
Well, so he's suing Facebook and he's suing Google, and Facebook he's suing a couple of different properties like Instagram and I think Facebook itself and Google for Android. And basically what he's saying is that the GDPR, one of the tenets of the GDPR is that you as an organization have to obtain consent from a data subject, from a person, to collect their data. And not only that, you really can't collect the data that's not specifically required to perform the service. And his interpretation, and by the way, I am not a lawyer, but his interpretation of the GDPR is that if you as a data subject have the right to decline consent to have your data collected and still receive the benefit of the service. So what he basically is saying is that, Facebook is running around, right, and they are doing this, by the way. Facebook is running around saying that, they've gotten consent from, the vast majority of their customer base in Europe has given the consent required under the GDPR. But it's a take it or leave it thing, right? It's you can provide consent, or you no longer are allowed to use Facebook or Instagram. I mean, I'm probably overly dramatizing that a little bit, but that's effectively what the claim is. So Max is actually, or I should say Mr. Schrems, has actually formed a company or like a nonprofit called None of Your Business. And that nonprofit's sole purpose is going to be to sue companies who they believe are running afoul of the GDPR.
Interesting.
So, look out. It's going to get interesting.
Well, this reminds me of there were companies that were spun up just to go after companies in the U.S. that didn't abide by the Americans with Disability Act.
Absolutely.
It ended up, those, I would say most people in general felt that was a racket and a shakedown of a lot of companies. So hopefully that's not where this ends up going as just a get-rich-quick scheme for lawyers, and is actually a meaningful endeavor.
Well, yeah, I mean, I will say that I know, that Max Schrems is a very well-known privacy activist. I don't know what will happen over the long term, but I do think that he is, from his perspective, acting in, he's trying to do what he believes is the right thing.
Sure.
For the privacy.
In his case, sure. I'm just wondering about other folks spinning up similar endeavors.
Well, I will tell you, and this is starting to turn into that GDPR show we talked about, but in the run-up to the GDP to May 25th, when the GDPR took effect, there were lots of, I guess, somewhat tongue-in-cheek data request forms that people were kind of jointly putting together so that they could submit to all, everybody that they thought had their data, which, would just ask an obnoxious number of questions about, what kind of data did they have, where did it come from, and, and on and on and on and on. And, I do think that there very likely is some of that going on today. I've not seen any statistics on that. I don't know if there's companies out there that are, finding these requests to be onerous. In general, the GDPR gives data subjects or the data controllers 1 month to respond. So, you have to respond in a reasonable time frame, but in no case more than, I think, a month, unless there's some extenuating circumstances. So I suspect probably later this month we'll start hearing some of the ugly about handling data requests.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I wonder if there's also a judgment to be made for certain companies to say, we're just not going to deal with European customers.
Well, we've seen some of that. There have been a couple of I'm drawing a blank on their names right now, but we have seen a couple of cases of that. We saw I'm still not sure if this was a joke or a real thing, but we saw the browser or the website plugin that would block access to European citizens. And by the way, I don't, again, we're all catching up here, but on May 25th, and I don't know where it stands now, but on May 25th, there were quite a few U.S. news outlets like the L.A. Times, and I don't remember which other ones. AZ Central comes to mind for some reason. Quite a few websites actually went dark from the perspective of the EU because they basically said we're not. I'm paraphrasing, but the website said we're not. You're coming from the EU. We're not GDPR compliant yet, so. There's nothing for you to see here.
Right.
And then there was EasyDNS. I don't remember if we talked about this one or not, but EasyDNS is a Canada-based DNS company, and they kind of flipped the bird to the GDPR because there's the whole hoopla about the Whois registration being
right.
Not in compliance with the GDPR, but if you're a domain registrar, contractually you have to maintain the Whois registries.
I think what we're finding is the crap ton of unintended consequences of such a broad sweeping law. And it'll be interesting how it all plays out.
Yeah. I do wonder about those unintended consequences. I think we're gonna be feeling the effects of that for a while. So anyway, more to come for sure.
Yep.
So anyway, that's the show for this week. I think now that we're both back, summer vacation season is over. We should hopefully be back on a normal schedule.
Sounds good to me.
All right. Well, take care, and we'll talk again hopefully next week.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye.